What was the British perspective on the war effort? Who was leading the war effort or not in Parliament and in Britain and London? I know some thought that they needed to do, as you mentioned in your book, a holding action. That they had to fight the French on the continent, and this was a backwater, but they had to keep going. But it was a holding action, and they wanted to get the Napoleon defeated first, and then come over and deal with us. But who was in that war effort?
Well, all eyes in Europe or in England were focused on Europe. Winning the war against Napoleonic France was the overarching, overriding foreign policy of the objective of the British throughout this period. The declaration of war by the United States came as something of a surprise to them, and it was a distraction, a sideshow. And basically, what they tried to do was to fight, as you say, a holding action. Sir George Prevost, who was the Governor General of Canada, was basically told, "Well, you have about all the assets you're going to have for a while. You got to do the best you can to preserve Canada." And he actually did a great job, and it's one of the unsung heroes of the war. On the other side, he was not very good in the field, and his enemies later attacked him for some of his failures in the field, and he became one of the goats on the British side in the War of 1812. But I think he ought to be remembered as the savior of Canada.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book, and we'll show a few of these illustrations as we go along, here is one just showing the various theaters of war, which I think was very instructive for anyone to see. And that's a good illustration, and they seem to be in 4 or 5 different areas where all the skirmishes and battles took place. Could you tell us a little bit about what the various theaters were briefly?
Well, this is one of the confusing things about the war. There were 7 major theaters of operation, 4 on the Canadian-American frontier. You have the Detroit River, the Niagara River, the St. Lawrence River, and then the Lake Champlain-Richelieu River corridor, a traditional north-south invasion route. Then you've got the Chesapeake, which is a 5th theater of operations, the Southwest, which is where Jackson fought the Creek War. That's number 6. I think, is that 6? Yeah. Number 7 is the Gulf Coast. Arguably, there is a St. Louis theater of operations, which Gillum dealt with. That would arguably be an 8th. And then you've got a 9th on the high seas. And one of the byproducts of having such a diffuse war is that it's very difficult for any commander, no matter how competent, to put his stamp on the war and carry the United States to victory. The other byproduct is the war is remembered differently in different areas depending on your experience there. It was very quickly forgotten on the Detroit and Niagara frontiers, and that despite the fact that 25% of all combat casualties occurred on the Niagara frontier, and yet in the Chesapeake, where there are a lot of depredations, they had very long memories. There are people in the Chesapeake today who are still very bitter about that.
I want to show a print that is in your book as well, in the color section. You have a beautiful color section as well, and we'll get to some of these illustrations still. But I want to show a print about Tippecanoe. We've had this in our stock before, but we happen to have one right now. And, of course, William Henry Harrison was there, so I have a couple of questions on this. First of all, did William Henry Harrison, who took this battle to ride it to the presidency, really bungle the battle? And secondly, what other military skirmishes were there prior, the antecedent to the war itself?
With regard to the first question first, I'd say that Harrison was attacked at the time, and probably plausibly for having failed to fortify his camp, which was, of course, ironic because Harrison was a scrupulous fortifier of camps. And we finally got to the neighborhood of the Prophet's Village. He left it unfortified. Now, why that is something that's never been quite clear to me. And I think that perhaps it was in fact an oversight. Though Harrison later claimed he hadn't had enough axes to really prepare adequate breastworks, which of course then pushes back the question of why he didn't have enough axes since he was marching into forested Indian country. Certainly, though, after the battle began, no one has ever successfully questioned Harrison's leadership or his courage. He was every part of the field constantly exposed, and none of the men who fought under him, I think, ever questioned his courage that day. And the battle ended with enough the appearance of a victory to make him president 30 years later.
Yeah. Well, this is a Kurz and Allison print from the late 19th century. They were here in Chicago, and these gorgeous colored prints that were emotional, and you'd love to have on your wall, but historically accurate, not really. But it certainly stirred the passions and got him to the presidency. Now, what was the military like back then? Were we prepared for this war, either on the seas or on the eastern seaboard for blockade, or Canada maybe taking over Canada as they wanted to do again? Or how about Illinois and its militia and regulars? Were we prepared anywhere? The generals were called big bugs, am I right?
Yes.
Well, there's no one better to talk about the overall picture than Don Hickey. And I'll yield to him. I have a couple of things about Illinois, but Don is the expert here.
Well, thank you, Gillum. The United States was woefully unprepared for this war. They expected what John Randolph called a holiday campaign. March up to the Canadian frontier, and those Canadians must hate the British as much as we do, so they're going to welcome us as liberators. The Army was in a really sad state. A decade of Jeffersonian economy had taken a heavy toll on the Army. The officers were a pretty sad state, at least at the senior level. The men were either recent recruits or not very well disciplined. And part of the legacy of this war was that the Army did develop professionalism. So we emerged from the war with a much better Army than we entered. Now, the Navy was in better condition at the beginning of the war, but it was under strength. But that was another byproduct of the war. We also committed to maintaining a larger Navy after the war, and also to upgrading its professionalism. But we certainly weren't prepared for war in 1812.
No, certainly not, especially against the great power in the world, Britain.
Well, I'd add one thing to that.
Yeah,
that in 1811, through sheer ideological stubbornness, the Madison administration had allowed the charter of the Bank of the United States to expire, and I think you agree that was the only institution in the country which could have financed a war. And to have done that the year before the United States declared war on the most powerful, or arguably one of the most powerful nations in the world, was sheer folly.
It was. One of the myths, though, is that the first Bank of the United States was not rechartered in 1811 when the nation knew it was going to war. Nobody in 1811 knew the nation was going to go to war. In fact, in 1812, we have Josiah Quincy, the leading Federalist in the House of Representatives, telling his friends after the war Congresses met, this is all talk. They're never going to take the final step. And when they did, it came as a surprise to many people, not only Federalists, but Jeffersonian Republicans alike.
Well, did we take ourselves down economically with the restrictive system? And we almost bankrupted ourselves. We were very close to going down, weren't we?
We did. You raise a question of who destroyed American prosperity in the age of Jefferson. It wasn't the British and the French with their depredations of American trade. It was our own government with a series of trade restrictions, beginning with the Non-Importation Act against England in 1806 and extending through the Non-Importation Act against England in 1811. The biggest, the most controversial one of those measures was the embargo. 15-month a prohibition on all goods or ships leaving American ports. That wrecked the American economy, and that was a policy of the U.S. government.
I should say, I will add that in Illinois territory, there was little preparation for war and little accommodation made after it began. And while it's true that the Illinois Territory is much less important to the War of 1812 than the War of 1812 was to the development of Illinois, it does illustrate, I think, dramatically how the United States, and for that matter the British, treated a lightly populated frontier, which really was the right flank of the British and the left flank of the United States, and the degree to which it was neglected. You know, at the outbreak of war, in Illinois Territory, this huge expanse of territory, there were 54 soldiers at Fort Dearborn. 365 miles south on the Ohio River at Fort Massacre were another 36, 90 soldiers to guard 110,000 square miles. So obviously the burden of self-defense fell on the settlers themselves, of whom there were perhaps 2,000, perhaps as many as 2,000 in position to bear arms. And the governor was Ninian Edwards, commander-in-chief of the militia, and he had the problem that throughout the war he was completely neglected and ignored by his boss, the Secretary of War. He couldn't get he'd send in frequent reports to the Secretary of War and couldn't get the Secretary to write him back. He never got a word of encouragement, a word of approval or disapproval of anything he'd done. He'd write for instructions, silence would come back. In fact, in the summer of 1812, his appointment expired, and they forgot to reappoint him for some months because the Illinois Territory was such a remote area. And admittedly, they had other things on their mind. But I don't think this is the only case of almost blind neglect of in this case, a minor theater, but of other theaters as well through the war. Would you agree?
This is a great point, yes. And it illustrates whatever your orders were from Washington, or for that matter, from Quebec or London. If you were out on the western fringe, you could probably do almost anything you wanted. And you're going to have trouble getting instructions from your own government about what they want you to do. So you had pretty much a free hand.
Well, there was no CNN, no Twitter, and things went very slowly, yes?
And in point of fact, governments themselves got a lot of their information from the frontier, not from their agents there, but from newspapers. Newspapers published. Those moved faster than letters did to spread news.
I have a question kind of quickly, right to this point. Both at the beginning of the war, it took time to know that the war was going. And at the end of the war, the other side was that they didn't know the war had ended and things were still going on. Was there anything that took place outside that parameters that, before, how long it took to get out there and they didn't know a war was going on and something happened? Or is there anything on the other side that someone kept going long after the treaty again?
Well, I don't think there's this idea that the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the Treaty of Ghent, which is true, but the idea that it was after the war was over is not fully true, because the treaty wasn't effective until it had been ratified by Congress and by Parliament, and ratifications had been exchanged, which happened, I think, in late February. Is that right? So, although both sides were trying to stand down, there was still, technically, legally, legal hostilities. In fact, the last battle that I'm aware of, which was fought a few miles north of St. Louis, the Battle of the Sinkhole, in which famous Chief Blackhawk commanded the Indian side, had it not been for a little thing called the Battle of Waterloo, it would have been the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars, but beaten out by that, of course. So,
what were the casualties of the war generally on all sides? We don't know the Indians.
You have to estimate these. We have battle casualties, but they are dwarfed by your losses to disease or accident. And that's, by the way, true for every American war up to World War II, when the sulfa drugs and penicillin reversed the balance there. But I reckon that the United States sustained about 20,000 deaths related to the war as a direct result of the war. The British probably 10,000, and all of the Indians on both sides maybe 7,500. As a proportion of their population, the Indians suffered the greatest number of casualties, or the greatest proportion. But those are the figures that I use, and I think they're a reasonable estimate.
Was the British targeting civilians as a punitive action? I mean, they did burn Washington. That was a bit punitive, I thought, especially after York. So,
well, they targeted civilian property, what they considered prize property. When they did conducted their raids along the Atlantic coast, they figured ships and goods that were going to be exported, even if they were being warehoused, were fair prize, and so they seized those. Now, their position on other private property was, if you had a house or a barn that was being used as a garrison, they could torch it. And they did take the position that if they found a homestead and it was empty, they figured the owner was out on militia duty and they could torch that homestead as well. And that's what caused so much of the bad blood in the Chesapeake that persisted for years afterwards.
You mentioned Ninian Edwards, and my question is going. Well, he was the father of Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law, future brother-in-law. So we have connections here to the Edwards. How was he as a war governor, out there without instructions from Washington?
Well, Edwards was a reasonably well-educated man for the day, and unusually so for the frontier. He was a graduate of Dickinson College and had, before being governor of Illinois, was Chief Justice of the highest court in Kentucky. position which he'd been appointed to because he was a Democrat and a friend or Jeffersonian Republican and a friend of the Madison administration. He was appointed as governor of Illinois without any particular connection to the new territory. He, as far as I know, never been here, and he received the appointment, which was considered an unimportant one after the first nominee had turned it down. So he has a reputation, not entirely undeserved, among historians as being sort of the prototype of the Illinois political hack. He had a long career. He was 9 years as territorial governor. He was a U.S. senator. He was ambassador to Mexico, though he never actually got there. He was third governor of the state of Illinois, and throughout his career, he never really can be associated with any particular principle. The hot issue in Illinois territory at that point was whether Illinois would ultimately be emerged as a slave state. And though there were riots in the streets on this issue, there were pamphlets and newspaper attacks on each other. It was the dominant issue not only of the late teens, but of the early 1820s. No one today can still say on which side of that issue Edwards fell. He was a complete placeholder. And that was the impression I had going in. But I will say that it changed to some extent. I regard my book as something of a rehabilitation of Ninian Edwards, at least as a war leader, from for the summer of 1811 till he was superseded in command in the summer of 1813, were, in my opinion, the two best years in the life of Ninian Edwards, where he showed a good deal of moral and, for that matter, physical courage. And some points, as I indicated, after his appointment had expired, continuing to serve as governor just because somebody had to do it. War had broken out, the frontier was in danger. He even pledged his own personal resources to the militiamen if the government disallowed what he had done. He was ultimately reappointed. But for 2 years, I think he did his full duty to the territory that had been committed to his care, even if you can in some ways question his judgment on some things. It was, as I say, I think the two best years in his life.